Okay, thank you for that introduction. And I literally just arrived in the town about 15 minutes ago. I was due to arrive last night, and I missed the flight connection in Amsterdam. And so the flight only arrived here in time for me to drive now from the airport. So that's why I'm looking a bit disheveled, not particularly smart, but I've no idea how competent your English is, so I suspect I will have to speak more slowly than I would normally speak. I don't know. Can you hear me? Is it clear what I'm saying? Yes. Good. You have to blame one of the students who used to be at this university for sitting here listening to me, Natalia, who is currently a PhD student of mine. She studied at Sheffield doing a master's program and now doing a PhD, and it seems that she suggested to some of your colleagues here that it might be a good idea if I visited, and surprisingly some money was obtained to invite me here. So that's the connection. Natalia Jarasenko, one of your former colleagues. All right, this is a lecture about a new global social policy, the social protection floor, about which I will say more in a minute. It's a global social policy which has been devised by the International Labour Organization, but it's also been supported by the United Nations systems more generally. It's been endorsed by the G20 group of governments in the G20 meetings in Paris and in Mexico in 2011, 2012. And the World Bank has also paid at least lip service to the idea of this global policy. So it's quite important development in international social policies, global social policies. So what is it? I hope to tell you a bit about what it is. Why did it come about? How can we explain the development of this policy? Is it of any use? What value is it? And if you like, will it prevail? Will the policy continue to be important? Now, my understanding of this policy is partly based on documentary analysis, simply reading the documents and interviews, but also, and most importantly, I spent 6 months sitting inside the International Labour Organization in the period when they were promulgating this policy, doing, in effect, anthropology in an international organization, listening to people over coffee, following them to the toilets, reading their emails when I shouldn't have been reading their emails, basically understanding how the process worked inside the International Labour Organization. And that's given me a particular insight into how this policy emerged. Just about that question of method, if you like, because that's quite an unusual method to study social policy. It has advantages and limitations. Even if you sit for 6 months in the same offices where this policy is being developed, you still don't really get to all the information. There are phone calls, conversations in corridors which you miss. On the other hand, you do actually follow several different players, if you like, actors at the same time. And so sometimes you have a greater understanding of the whole than any individual actor in it, if that makes sense. So there are a number of individuals I will talk about later who played a part, but I think I actually understood more about the connections between those than the actual players themselves. But anyway, an interesting experiment in anthropology inside an institution. Right, the presentation looks like this. What is global social protection floor? What's significant about it? Why am I talking about it? Why bother? Why did it come about? And what is it that has changed about what I'm calling the global governance of social protection, the way in which the world as a whole manages or governs social protection? How should we evaluate it? And as I say, what are the prospects for this having any real continuity and sustainability? There will be copies of this PowerPoint on something like one of your web pages. I don't quite know which one, but you will be able to access this PowerPoint yourself, so don't feel you need to scribble things down from this lecture. So, I'll talk about this in a moment. What we're going to be talking about is a recommendation decided upon by the International Labour Conference, which runs the International Labour Organization, in June of 2012, that says these things. First, a few words about the International Labour Organization. It was set up in 1919, quite interestingly, after the then First World War. And it was set up as part of the Treaty of Versailles after that First World War in order to try and avoid a situation where in future countries were in competition with each other economically, and one part of that competition would be, if you like, a race to the bottom of driving down labour standards and so on. And the argument was, really we ought to have a common set of labour regulations, how many hours people work, the kind of social security arrangements that go with that. There was an idea that there should be a common set of global standards which would avoid this economic competition between countries where the main thing would be to do is to get investment and not to concern with questions of social protection. So it's very an organization which really was 100 years ahead of its time. You know, the idea that that mattered, global competition, and that standards within each country mattered in 1919 is really very important. So that's the origins of the International Labour Organization, and it became part of the United Nations system, and it still exists. Obviously, it's based in Geneva, and it sets standards that encourages countries to keep in terms of pensions policy, in terms of unemployment policy, in terms of, in a minute, the social protection floor policy. One other thing about the ILO is that how it's managed. Some people argue it's the most democratic of the United Nations agencies because it is policies decided upon by the conference every year, and the conference is constituted of three elements: a tripartite structure of governance. Half of the people who sit there represent governments, all governments of the world, mainly the ministries of labour and social affairs or pensions. A quarter of the conference are trade unionists, represented by the International Trade Union Confederation and their spokespeople inside the ILO, and the other half of the quarter are representatives of business in each country. So it's parliamentarians, trade unionists and employers formulate these global policies. So I think as a policy-making process, it's quite interesting. Okay, so this is what was resolved upon in 2012. All countries, they argued, should do these four things. They should guarantee that all children receive an entitlement to a basic income, all people should do the same, all those who are unable to work for a variety of reasons should have such access to a level of living that would be set by the countries, and that there should be access to some basic entitlements of health care. So a recommendation to all countries that there should be these things guaranteed. More than simply saying countries should. More than simply saying that countries should secure a guaranteed income for children, a guaranteed income for old age, a guaranteed income in working life, and access to health care. The recommendations set out a number of other considerations. It's okay. It's okay, no problem. The recommendation said there should be two elements of this. there should be a horizontal floor where everybody was, if you like, provided with a minimum below which one should not fall. But also there should be a vertical element to this, which said the more developed a country, the more it should develop a vertical, improved system of social security, wage-related benefits, so that you had a bit of higher pensions if you had higher money, higher unemployment benefits if you were earning more at work, and so on. So a floor that way, but also, if you like, a set of wage-related benefits on the vertical axis. Second important point really was the principles that the ILO argued that should underpin this kind of social policy. And these are very important principles, that this really should be a policy providing income on a universal basis. Everybody should be entitled, not, as often is the case, targeted only to a section of the population on some basis of means or other tests. A universal approach to this, with the beneficiaries having rights and entitlements to dispute their allocation if they felt that it was inappropriate, and financed out of a progressive taxation system. So these are really quite progressive social policy statements. Universal entitlements for all, financed out of a tax system which took more from the better off than the poorer, and gave people the right to challenge eligibility entitlements and so on. As I say, endorsed by the United Nations and the G20. I shall come back to that in a moment. And then endorsed by the World Bank. The World Bank statement there. The World Bank has an important role to play both in helping countries who sign onto the social protection floor to operationalise it and in knowledge sharing. Why is that important? Why am I drawing attention to this? Why am I drawing attention to the World Bank seeming to agree with the International Labour Organization on these questions?
Because the World Bank is fighting the poverty, basically, and setting the goal.
Say it again?
Well, it has set as one of the goals a 3% goal of poverty below $125 per day, I guess.
Okay. Why might I be suggesting that the World Bank on the one hand and the International Labour Organization on the other have not necessarily agreed on these social policy questions? Okay, I'll tell you. If you read the book I wrote some years ago now, Global Social Policy and Governance, what you would find is an argument there which says that international organizations, for example, the ILO and the World Bank, as just two of them, have been in competition with each other with regard to the right to make policies about poverty for the world and with the content of that policy. And the classic contest between the ILO and the World Bank was during the 1980s, 1990s, and the beginning years of this century, when both organizations had very different recommendations to post-communist social policies, to post-communist countries, where the World Bank, in the area of pensions, to take that as an example, where the World Bank was saying what one should do is to set up private individual savings accounts invested in the private sector, and your benefit will depend on how that investment develops. The ILO, on the other hand, was saying you should have guaranteed, defined benefits provided through a contributory system where the state and the employer and yourselves make contributions. So very, very different, state versus market, if you like to oversimplify it, between the bank and the ILO on what was the best way of overcoming poverty in old age. So historically there's been a contest between those two organizations. That's why it's important to note that the bank is here saying we support the social protection floor. It seems like there's a merging of the two organizations addressing the same policy. We'll come back to that a little later. Okay, so that's what the social protection floor recommendation is to countries, that they should do these things according to those principles and funded in that way. Why is it significant? I mean, what needs explaining here? one thing that's significant is that this is an agreement to set up a global set of ideas about social policy. Not so long ago, in the year 2000, there was a much earlier attempt then to do this. Gordon Brown, who was then the Chancellor of the Exchequer in the United Kingdom, but also very active in the international arena, argued that the IMF and the World Bank should agree a set of social policy principles, and he said that whenever the IMF or the World Bank worked with countries, they should ensure investment in health, ensure investment in education, and ensure some kind of equitable social security system. At that point, in the year 2000, he put that idea to the United Nations in Geneva, the conference. A very large number of southern countries objected to that. India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Egypt, Indonesia. I was there at the time, at that meeting. And they said, we don't want a global standard. We don't want an agreed set of social policy principles operating in each country. A, because they're your standards and not ours. It's the notion that maybe standards are different in each country. But most importantly, they said, because we think that you will use that, if we don't adhere to those standards, we think you will use that as a reason not to trade with us. Okay, that's quite an important point. Let me elaborate on that. Because there had been, only 2 or 3 years earlier, a discussion within the World Trade Organization, which monitors and regulates world trade. There had been a discussion within that all countries should adopt the same labour standards. The idea way back from 1917 of the International Labour Organization. So the Europeans and the Americans and others were saying there should be a common set of labour standards. Same kind of entitlements to hours of work and so on. At that conference too, southern countries said, no way, we are not going to agree to this because we know you will use it as a basis for not trading with us. In other words, you won't want to trade with countries that undercut those standards. And you'll want to protect your European high labour standards. So there was this idea that on the one hand there's an attempt to get a common global standard, but those countries who weren't yet there saying, actually we benefit from not having that standards. We benefit from paying our workers less, paying them no unemployment benefit, paying them no pensions, having dirty working conditions, having no safety at work. We poor countries benefit from that, and therefore that's our comparative advantage. That's why we can be in the global trading system. So there's a long period of tension, if you like, between the global north and the global south about this idea of achieving a set of common standards, whether they're labour standards or social standards. And as I say, in the year 2000, that kind of argument existed, and the idea of a common set of global social standards was rejected. So 2012, we now have a common set of recommendations about social policy, so that needs explaining. Yeah? What happened between the year 2000 and the year 2012 to make it possible to get to a point of making, if you like, as I see it, progress on that? Another thing that needs explaining is this is a recommendation that says all residents of a country should have this access to some minimum set of income. Not all workers in the country. The ILO historically has been about workers' benefits, workers' pensions. This is about citizens, or residents even, pensions. How come? How did that happen? Why did the ILO suddenly start talking about everybody and not just employed workers? The third thing, as I say, is important. How come it became a policy which so rapidly became accepted by the United Nations system, the G20 and the World Bank? And how come we got, at the end of this process, the establishment of a new body called the Social Protection Interagency Cooperation Board, which is a board which is set up to oversee the global management of social protection, that's jointly chaired by the ILO and World Bank. Such a body didn't exist before 2012. It came into existence in 2012. It brings together a number of agencies: UNICEF, Help Aid International, Save the Children, WHO, ILO, etc., etc. But it's jointly managed by the ILO and the World Bank. How come? So in other words, why this policy is important are those kinds of things. It suddenly seems to have broken through this problem of not getting international agreement. It seems to have enabled the International Labour Organization to talk about residents rather than just workers. It has been widely adopted, and a new organization to kind of bring those different actors together has come into existence. Why? How come? That's what I wanted to explain, right? You know, why did this happen? Now, this PowerPoint is going to look extremely complicated, right? I shall put it all up, and then I shall talk about it slowly, and I hope that it becomes clear. So bear with me. Bear with me. I don't know how many of you have studied sociology. How many are sociology students? Just hands up. Several of you, many of you, okay. So it's the explanatory framework that I'm using is based on, you know, conventional stuff in sociology. Based on kinds of explanations which are common practice, if you like, within sociology. On the one hand, social structure is important. You know, the nature of the economic and social structure shapes a lot of things about our policies. The social structure issues are important. The social structural constraints are important. Structure, yeah? Actors, agency, people act within that, whether they are organizations like business or trade unions or social movements, act within those structural constraints to try and change things. So you have structure, agency. And, you know, people make, if you like, policies in conditions that they found already existing the structures. So structure, then the actors. Within that mix, you have to put institutions. You know, there are important institutions. Once institutions become established, they tend to be a bit frozen. There's the idea of path dependency. Once you have, for example, a conservative corporatist or a Bismarckian welfare state like Germany or France, once you have that kind of structure, it's quite difficult to change it, right? So institutional structures frame the way things develop. And finally, ideas or discourses. Ideas in people's heads, the way people talk about things, policy ideas, if you like, matter. So you have this notion of structure, agency, institutions, ideas or discourses. And I'm using that broad framework, but I'm making a couple of other points about it. I'm making the point that institutions aren't necessarily frozen. They can be changed, right? Remember, I'm trying to say, how did the ILO get to be changed, right? And they can be changed, if you like, by discussion. There is a strand of institutionalism called discursive institutionalism. Discussions inside institutions can change things. They're not absolutely frozen. And the other thing I'm trying to draw attention to is the actors or agents, people who act to try and change things, can be individuals. Very often we think of political parties or pressure groups or campaigns or business interests as the agencies. I'm drawing attention to individual, in this case, individuals within the international governance system, international civil servants. So, how do I put these things together and begin to offer an explanation? First, in terms of structure, right? There are two key things about, oh no, there's one sentence I should articulate before that. Most sociology is focused on countries, yeah? National structures, national actors, national institutions, national ideas. What this is about global, right? It's making that explanation global. So we need to talk about global structures, global actors, global institutions, and global ideas, okay? So global structure, what was important about global structure was the economic and social crisis of 2008. That crisis of the economy, the global economy in 2008, I argue it in the book. All this, by the way, is just a hurried summary of this book. So if you don't understand a word, you can always buy the book and see if it makes any more sense. The economic crisis of 2008, I argue in the book, created a situation where a new global economic structure within which people felt they had to act. The second important structural change that had taken place was that since 2000, remember the problem, 2000 we couldn't do anything, 2012 we could. Since 2000, a very large number of poorer countries had developed their own social protection arrangements. Latin America suddenly had a whole range of policies, conditional benefits for children so long as they went to school, conditional benefits for mothers so long as they went to health clinics and so on. A whole range of conditional cash transfers. And a large number of countries developed social pensions, pensions for everybody. South Africa, Swaziland, Botswana, a number of other countries. So my point is that there were key international changes, the economic crisis and the fact that a large number of southern countries had already developed emerging social protection systems, which, if you like, changed the situation from the year 2000. In terms of ideas, the idea that was important was the idea that we needed to mend globalization, that globalization, if you like, was an economic competition between countries which was in danger of creating a race to the, as we call it, the welfare bottom, that people would be impoverished, lose their securities in that global economic competition. So the idea emerged of some kind of social floor to this global economy. In terms of the institution, as I said already, the institution that needed to change was the ILO, and that shifted its thinking from focus on workers to a focus on residents. And then individual agents, people acting inside that, were key to changing those ideas. So in other words, to read, if you like, from the PowerPoint, what I'm arguing is in this book that social protection floor resulted, if you like, from the intersection of the biographies and careers of individuals about which I'm going to talk in a minute, okay? They were the actors, the key agents, biographies, with the idea that the world needed a global social floor, an idea which had been around for quite a long time, but an idea whose time came in the year 2008 when the global economic crisis hit, if you like. So the idea became more important because of that structural situation in 2008. And that enabled people working in the ILO to find an institution where that idea could be cemented, if you like. So ideas are quite important, but if ideas get inside institutions and institutions support them, they become more powerful. So in other words, certain individuals, about which I'm going to talk more, use the idea, which was already in existence, there should be some kind of global social floor. Because of the circumstances of 2008, that idea got propelled to prominence, and it enabled people inside the ILO to not only change ILO policy, but as we shall see, the policy of other actors too. So what's particular about this explanation? What's particular about this explanation, and it follows from that anthropology that I was talking about earlier on, is it draws attention to individual international civil servants. individual international civil servants are often anonymous, hidden from view apparatchiks, right? All you learn about is the World Bank policy, the ILO policy, UNICEF policy. Yeah? How did the policy get made? Who steered it? Who drafted it? Who engineered it through the system? The International Labour Organization, as I said, its constitution is the meeting of all governments of the world, parliamentarians, employees, employers, huge gathering. You know, the official story is that that global conference meeting in June 2012 made the policy. Nonsense, right? Nonsense. The policy that was made by that huge gathering in June 2012 had been drafted way back, 2000, 2005, 2010, right? Been drafted by international civil servants, people who actually could see the possibility of changing the way the ILO thought about these questions. So what the global gathering in 2012 did was endorse the office view of what should be. So what I'm trying to argue is that if you're trying to understand the emergence of this policy, but it applies to many, many other policies, and here it's international organizations that I'm talking about, but clearly you could also talk about national policies, is that you really need to track the emergence of the documents which are the embryonic beginnings of policies which are initially written by civil servants who have a view that they want to see prevail. So there, in my view, there were four movers and shakers, four key individuals. I just want to talk a little bit about each of these. To make it come a bit more to life. Michael Shishon, this is, I'm going from sort of left to right here. Yeah, left to right. Michael Shishon became director of the Social Security Department of the International Labour Organization in 2005. But before then, he'd already begun to think about this concept of the ILO should talk about all residents in the country and not just workers, because the conventional ILO's policies about pensions and so on really only covered a small fraction of the world's population. Okay, in Europe, a lot of people are covered by those kind of schemes. In Latin America and Africa, 10%, 5%. Okay, so the ILO had historically addressed the concerns of organized workers who were a very small proportion of the population. So Michael Shishon believed that we should shift the agenda to talking about everybody, a tax-based benefit for everybody. He was working away with these ideas in 2000. He became head of the department in 2005, began to draft some of the earlier thinkings about that, and was in a perfect position then to persuade the workers group, the employers group, and certain countries of value of that. And in the end, if you trace the words that came out in 2012 from the earlier documents that he wrote, there's a lot of similarity. That's my point. So he was a key player focusing inside the ILO. Within that context, Joan Samovier was the Director General of the ILO, and he played a part in selling this idea to the world in a very general sense. He was a Chilean. He got his co-country compatriot, Michelle Bachelet, who was about to become Chilean president. She was Chilean president once before, to write a report on the case for the social protection floor. So while Shishon was focusing inside the ILO, Samovier was focusing on selling the idea, if you like, to the world. So far, so good. Then comes along somebody that nobody's heard of, who was extraordinarily important. Okay, I need to say one more thing before I get to him. Joan Samovier found himself in 2008-2009 as chair of the United Nations Chief Executive Board. the United Nations bring all their different agencies together, right? By chance, he was chairing that in 2008, 2009, which gave him the opportunity of saying, in the context of this global crisis that I was talking about, we need a global policy on social protection. So he formulated the United Nations Social Protection Floor Initiative. Michael Shishon, who'd been working around the idea of a social protection floor, was taken by surprise. Oh, fantastic. I'm not only working in my little department about this, but here is the Director General devising a policy of the Social Protection Floor Initiative. And he set up an organization called the UN Social Protection Floor Initiative, which brought together the ILO, WHO, the World Bank, a number of others, in order to try and promulgate this idea. I need to get across a point which is quite complicated. Not that the others haven't been as well, but let me try and get across the point which is quite complicated, which I find interesting. I don't know whether you will. Shishon, when he became head of the Social Security Department in 2005, I thought, right, now's my chance to develop this idea. I will set up a global policy advocacy coalition for the social protection floor. I will bring all my mates that I know in the UNICEF, in UNDP, in Help Age International, in Save the Children, in Oxfam. I'll bring all my mates I know to a meeting in Turin in 2007, and we will set up a global campaign for this social protection floor, which is what he did. So as part of his work, he developed a campaign for the social protection floor. Suddenly, his boss, Ron Sommerville, set up this UN Social Protection Floor Initiative. It's a formal organization that brought various people together. And so this informal policy campaign group suddenly found itself rather more official. Right? So you got an official alliance of different UN agencies, the UN Social Protection Floor Initiative. So things seemed to be going very well. We would get to this policy, we would have all different agencies together working to the same policy objective of laying down this social protection floor. Now, unfortunately, working away in Joan Sommerville's office was Vinicius Pinheiro, a fellow Latin American. And Vinicius Pinheiro knew that Joan Sommerville is going to be finishing being president of the ILO in about a year's time. And he knew he was Joan Sommerville's right-hand man because he was the same nationality, if you like. It's the way things work sometimes. But Vinicius Pinheiro thought, shit, I'm not going to have a job in a year or two's time. You know, my boss, Joan Sommerville, is going to leave. How am I going to look to my future? How am I going to secure my career? How am I going to secure a place in the UN system? So he spent his time going to G20 meetings. The ILO could go to the G20 meetings that were meeting in Paris and then meeting in Mexico to do two things. Argue for the social protection floor as an idea, and he was very successful in doing that. So if you like, the ILO, through Vinicius, persuaded the G20 of that policy idea. Good. But he also went to the G20 with the idea that there should be established a coordinating framework that brought the ILO and the World Bank together to manage global social protection. And the G20 said, yes, you should. You should set up the Social Protection Interagency Coordination Board, of which Vinicius is now secretary, because he's now deputy director of the ILO office in New York. So it sounds complicated and perhaps tedious, but what I'm trying to point to is that this guy merely wanted the ILO policy to be agreed, right? He's quite excited to find his boss saying, let's make it broader. And so he brought all these agencies together that he was working with anyway into the UN Social Protection Floor Initiative looked good, then really unbeknownst was this guy working away on a parallel track, but ending up setting up a quite separate coordinating body, the Social Protection Interagency Coordination Board. I'll come back to that in a few minutes, because the UN Social Protection Floor Initiative was one thing that was trying to pull actors together. The Social Protection Floor Interagency Coordination Board was another thing that was trying to pull actors together, and it got messy. 5 minutes time. The other key player was somebody called Isabel Ortiz, who worked for UNICEF. She was part of Michael Shishon's coalition, this policy advocacy coalition for this idea. Key partner in the Social Protection Floor Initiative, helped create a website for this. Interestingly, she is now head of the ILO Social Protection Department. Shishon left to go to an NGO, and Isabel took his job with a new name. So I can't tell all the details, but here is I'm making a case that individuals, their ambitions, their careers, their biography, and their ideas matter a lot in the shaping of policy. This simply tells that story again. I think I'll skip that one. You see, I said the ILO was a tripartite organization. I said the ILO policy was made by workers, employers, governments. It's tripartite. What I am arguing is it ain't a tripartite organization, it's a quadripartite organization. There are 4 bits to this institution, and the key important bit is the secretariat. Right? The secretariat matter, right? The secretariat make policy. If you go to the ILO decision-making offices in Geneva, you will be faced with a room not unlike this, but split into segments. So half down the middle is government, a quarter down there are trade unionists, a quarter down there are employers. But here is the bench on which sits the secretariat. And it's not exactly a dialogue between the workers, the government, and the employers. It's a dialogue between each one of those and the office, right? So the office sits there, Shishon sits there, all his colleagues sit there with their draft documents, which they have written, out of their top drawer over the years, right? And it's to that that the conference is responding. So I'm making an argument that we should really think of the policy making in the ILO in that way. So what has all this got to say about the global governance of social protection? I said already, historically, there had been this conflict, okay? 2 ministers of social security, the World Bank wanting one thing, the ILO wanting another thing, competition between the two, okay? Along comes the United Nations Social Protection Floor Initiative, built on the basis of a global campaign, suddenly become endorsed by the UN, that brings a whole range of people together, including the World Bank, to promulgate the social protection floor as a key idea, right? Fine. But then suddenly, as I explained already, another organization comes up, the Social Protection Interagency Coordination Board. Then there was who's going to chair this? And I saw the emails. The email from the ILO to the bank saying, the ILO will chair this. The email from the bank to the ILO saying, no, the bank will chair this, right? Literally, that's how it was resolved, right? And they said, no, we'll jointly chair it, right? We'll jointly chair this, right? But, you see, the problem was this. All those people from NGOs like Help Age International, Save the Children, well-meaning people from the other UN agencies, had been working together in the UN Social Protection Floor Initiative, excited about the prospect of the social protection floor being agreed as policy in 2012, which it was. They had been meeting as a social protection floor coordinating body, 2009, 10, 11, they had been meeting. they're suddenly faced with this body, which met for the first time in July 2012, just after the ILO had agreed its policy. They all went along to this new body and found themselves not talking about the social protection flaw, but talking about social protection more generally, and found themselves in a body jointly chaired by the World Bank. So what would have been a simple process of the ILO expanding its idea and bringing in other actors was complicated by this separate emergent body. So the point I'm trying to tell here, and I'm getting over 3/4 of the way through what I need to talk about. The point I'm trying to draw attention to here is that possible bringing together of the World Bank and the ILO as two quite different actors now working together doesn't look as simple as that. It became more complicated. And there was a particular hiatus, a particular set of problems between about July 2012 and July 2013. Michael Shishon, who'd been driving this policy, left the ILO. He retired. He's gone to the International Federation of Social Workers. No, the ICSW, International Council of Social Welfare. Shishon left. Isabel Ortiz, a key actor, if you recall, had been working in UNICEF, spending a lot of time having a discussion with UNICEF and the IMF about IMF's policies on austerity. She was sacked from UNICEF, or rather she resigned from UNICEF because she was too progressive, too radical with regard to the IMF. There was a year of nobody in the ILO in charge. Isabel from UNICEF had disappeared from the scene, and the bank thought, aha, right, we can regain some of the influence on global social protection policy during this period, and set up an entirely new thing called Sparks. Out of the blue came Sparks, the Social Protection Assessment of Results and Country Systems. And the World Bank brought together all the traditional actors, Help Aged International, Save the Children, WHO, development agencies, etc., invited the ILO, but ILO was headless in terms of the Social Security Department at that point, to this new meeting. And they never once talked about the social protection flaw. They talked about kind of bank methodology for assessing social protection. So what might have been a really close coming together of the World Bank and the ILO through this story became fragmented because of the particular career ambitions of a particular minor civil servant inside the ILO. Okay, so what about it? How can we evaluate the social protection flaw? Is it worth talking about? Is it a worthwhile policy? Is it a good thing or not? This is Michael Shishon. It's a breakthrough, he says, in global social policy. But he makes the point that we've gone as far as we can as a global organization. We've set up a policy which has got global legitimacy. Everybody agrees it's a good idea. There should be this social minimum, but now we have to turn it into practice. Therefore, we have to go into individual countries and make the case for the social minimum. And he himself has left the ILO to chair the International Council of Social Welfare, which is a representative body of organizations which do that job as NGOs in countries. So he said, we've gone as far as we can. We've got a global policy that says everybody should have this minimum entitlement to income of the kind that we've talked about. Now let's do it, right? Back from the global down to the national. But the social protection flaw as a policy could be criticised. It could be criticised on 4 counts. When Shishon started talking about it, he was really talking about We want universal social pensions, we want universal child benefits, very specific, precise, actual benefits. All pensioners will get a universal social pension. All children will get a universal social family allowance. There were very specific, concrete policy benefit ideas. In the process of negotiating through the big body, he lost some of what he was aiming for, and so the benefits become outcomes determined by countries themselves. In other words, how countries actually provide that minimum. How they do it is up to them. So in a sense, you begin to lose the idea of a global policy, becomes rather more a set of national policies. At one point, the language was, there will be a global social floor. There will be global social protection floor. The language is now, there will be national social protection floors, the S, right? Each one different to t'other. The countries in the ILO which made sure that they were floors and not a floor, China, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh. Yeah? The same old story of, if you like, emerging economies or developing economies saying we want to do it our way, we're going to develop our floor according to our means, and so it again erodes the idea of a global policy. There had been a lot of idea about there being international financial support for this. That rather got watered down. And the final point was, okay, I have made a lot of the idea that the ILO is now talking about residents and not just workers, yeah, which is very important. I mean, most countries, workers are 10-20% of the population formally employed. Residents are the other 80%, right? But there was a clause, this should be available to all residents as determined by countries themselves. In other words, many people resident in the country are not legally resident. In other words, illegal cross-border movers, those not regarded as formally resident, but actually living there, become excluded. So there's a big debate about whether this excludes significant parts of the population. Finally, what's the future for this policy? I'm going to be, because I've spoken now for an hour, very, very quickly, and this is the very last part of the presentation. The future for the social protection floor policy depends on a whole number of things. This is what this PowerPoint says. First, I'm talking about, will this idea fly at a global level? Will it keep being talked about at a global level? Will the United Nations keep talking about it? You know, when Ban Ki-moon, as UN General Secretary, speaks, will he say, social protection floor, as many times as he said Millennium Development Goals, for example? You know, will it become an important idea that will stick at that global level? It's not sure, right? At the moment, a lot of the discussion in the UN is about what will replace the Millennium Development Goals, which had been a global policy that the UN had set up. And a lot of the discussion is about sustainability and ecological environmental issues, and climate change, which is very important. Some people worry whether the social protection floor idea will stay there or not. Another question about its future is, as I said, within this SPIAC-B, this Social Protection Interagency Coordination Board, jointly chaired by the ILO and the World Bank, it's kind of slipped off the agenda of SPIAC-B. The United Nations Social Protection Floor Initiative, which was driving it, has not met for 18 months. Will Isabel Ortiz, who took up her job this month in the ILO, what's she going to do? Right? She was a key supporter of the UN Social Protection Floor Initiative, worried about the Social Protection Floor Interagency Coordination Board, which has got World Bank influence. how's she going to play it? Is she going to revitalise the UN Social Protection for All Initiative? Is she going to argue with the bank in the Social Protection Interagency Coordination Board? How is she going to do it? So her career, her ambitions, her commitments are going to shape this. Okay, within countries, how are we going to make these things work in poorer countries? It depends absolutely, or a large part on, the International Monetary Fund, whether they're going to encourage and permit the fiscal space in countries to afford these things, right? And there's a big debate inside the IMF, as you probably are aware, as a consequence of the austerity policies following on from the economic crisis. Most countries are cutting their public expenditure. Absurdly, because cutting their public expenditure means it's going to make the economy even worse, right? Keynesian policy of increasing public expenditures in order to give people money to spend in order to get the economy developed, right? But most countries have gone down the road of austerity and cutting services. The IMF are now beginning to talk rather more sympathetically about the idea that there should be more taxes raised in order to fund more social benefits. And on the plane, I was reading a chapter, I'll reference it in the last slide, by the IMF on financing social protection floors, considerations of fiscal space, which draws the conclusion that poorer countries do need to raise more taxes in order to create more possibilities of spending on social protection, which will then give people money in their pockets to spend on goods and services. So the tide, if you like, is turning away from this absurd austerity period to one where we may tax and spend more. But it depends a bit on the IMF. Okay, so these are all the ways in which the social protection floor policy idea might or might not fly, be sustained. Quite interestingly, the United Nations human rights people, two key actors inside there as well, very, very recently argued there should be a global fund to help poorer countries develop a social protection floor. There's a global fund for AIDS, TB and malaria, global health fund. There's a global education fund to put kids into school, a fast track initiative. There's no global fund for social protection. And this argues, for poorer countries there should be perhaps a global fund which matches their own funds. You raised so much by your taxation, we'll double it. So that idea might or might not fly. And then finally, it's Michael Shishon's thing, the International Council of Social Welfare. Will there be campaigning groups of NGOs in countries trying to develop this? There is such a thing. There's a global alliance of about 40 NGOs trying to work in countries to secure that. Civil society and the social protection floor. They're arguing in favour of it. They're saying it should be rights-based, which it is. They're saying it should cover everybody, including the illegal migrants. And they have other things to say as well. So, I don't have a kind of summary slide, but I think the summary is something like this. The social protection floor, I think, is an important development in global social policy. It provides a framework within which people in all countries of the world can argue the case for such a policy. It legitimizes the idea of universal social entitlements to a standard of living below which people should not fall. The story of its development exemplifies the important role of international civil servants, their careers, their ambitions, their ideas, their interest in driving this policy. Thanks very much for listening. Those are the references.